So your first task in the assignment is to draw and label 2 complete cardiac cycles of an EKG waveform. So you're going to draw something that looks like this. And you would label these as your P wave, your QRS complex, and your T wave. And because we have 2 complete cardiac cycles here, that makes these the exact same. P, Q, R, S, and T. And these aren't exactly to scale, but it's enough to give us something to work with. So the next thing you're asked to do is label the mechanical activity that's accompanying each waveform. So we'll start with labeling the areas of depolarization and repolarization of both the ventricles and the atria. Or another way to think about this is the electrical activity of these areas of the heart. And that's essentially what this EKG is measuring. So the P wave represents the depolarization of the atria. When the muscles in these atria depolarize, they'll begin contracting, also known as atrial systole. This will happen shortly after the start of the P wave, about 25 milliseconds after the P wave starts. But for our purposes, it's okay for us to just think of it as also belonging to the P wave area of our EKG. The area of the EKG, represented by the QRS complex, is where our ventricles depolarize. If you consider that the ventricles are much larger, there's a much larger depolarization that's happening there, or a much larger electrical signal that's happening, and so it's a more significant area of the curve. Ventricular depolarization will be what makes ventricular systole possible. Actual contraction in the ventricles begins about at the peak of the R wave. The other thing that's happening during this area of the QRS complex is the atria that have depolarized at the P wave are repolarizing during QRS. But because the electrical activity of the ventricles is so much more significant than the atria due to the size and just the activity of that muscle, it just kind of gets overshadowed on the curve. So you don't really see it on our EKG. But it is important to consider that it would live here in this area of time. Lastly, your T wave represents the area of repolarization of the ventricles. The next portion of the assignment asks you to then look at the waveform and indicate the status of both the AV and the semilunar valves on various moments of the EKG as the valves being either open or closed. And I think this is the part that you seem to have had the most trouble with. And it's the portion of the assignment that's not as clearly pointed out in your text. So I wanted to take a minute to kind of think about that with you guys. So I think the first order of business is to review what these valves are, where they are, and what they're doing. So the AV valves, or the atrioventricular valves, live between the atria and the ventricles. So these valves need to be open when blood is moving from the atria to the ventricles. And your AV valves need to be closed when blood is moving from the ventricles out to the pulmonary or aortic circulation. Because by being closed, they prevent backflow of blood from the ventricles to the atria. Our other valve type, our semilunar valves, live between the ventricles and the pulmonary and the aortic vessels. And the semilunar valves need to be open when blood is leaving the ventricles and traveling to those greater vessels, the aorta or the pulmonary trunk. These valves will then close when blood is no longer leaving. Okay, so now let's think about what that means on our EKG, or what that would look like on our EKG. Let's think first about the ventricles and the semilunar valves. So your semilunar valves are going to be open when blood is leaving the ventricles. That's going to begin at ventricular systole, which starts, we said, about at the point of the R wave. Blood is leaving the ventricles here because the pressure in the ventricles that's been generated by contraction of the ventricles is greater than the pressure outside of the ventricles. And so that will continue from the peak of the R wave until the end of ventricular repolarization, when the ventricles are then relaxed again. So your semilunar valves are going to open at the start of this ventricular ejection at the peak of the R wave, and they're going to continue to stay open until the pressure decreases to the point that they'll snap back shut, and that happens during the T wave. These semilunar valves are then going to stay closed through the rest of the EKG, through the P wave, all the way through the beginning of the Q area until the R. Next, let's think about your AV valves. Your AV valves are open, and essentially open by default, and allow blood to flow from the atria to the ventricles. Your AV valves close when the ventricles are contracting. The papillary muscles pull down on the chordae tendineae and pull the cusps down to close the valves, and so this happens during ventricular systole, or during that ventricular ejection portion of the EKG. So this means that your AV valves close at about Q and remain closed until that ventricle is relaxed again, at which time they'll open and then stay open until the next time the ventricle contracts. The last portion of your assignment everyone seemed to do okay with, and it was answering the question of what can you learn by measuring from your R wave to R wave. I could have also said, what would you learn by measuring T to T or P to P? Just the idea that you start at one point in one complete cardiac cycle and make it to the next point in another complete cardiac cycle. And that's going to tell you how long it takes to complete a single cardiac cycle and can be interpreted as heart rate. So I hope that helps. As far as what you can expect for your exam, you should expect to have an EKG provided for you. You'll need to be able to label them by whether it's the P, QRS, or T area of the wave. You'll need to be able to identify where atrial or ventricular depolarization, repolarization, or systole happen. You'll need to have an idea of where and which valves open and close, and what points on the EKG they open or close. Okay, I'm here for any other questions that you may have. Please reach out. Thanks.